professor told me to forget everything she taught. But her eyes whispered I wasn't supposed to forget her. The first time she walked into the lecture hall, it was as if the air had subtly shifted. She carried herself with a quiet confidence, effortless yet precise, that made everyone else seem blurred at the edges. There was a grace in the way her heels clicked softly against the floor, a rhythm that drew the eye without demanding attention. He noticed the faint rustle of her notes as she adjusted them, and for a moment, the mundane sound felt intimate, almost secretive. He couldn't explain why, but every small gesture she made seemed magnified. The tilt of her head when she emphasized a point, the way her eyes lingered just long enough on a question from a student, or the subtle curve of her smile when she found humor in a dry textbook example. Each detail etched itself in his mind. He found himself watching, not in distraction, but in a kind of mesmerized awareness, sensing layers beneath the professional composure she presented to the world. Her voice carried a warmth that went beyond mere explanation. There was rhythm, subtle inflection, and softness at unexpected moments, like a pause that invited him to lean in closer, to hear not just the words but the thought behind them. It was impossible not to notice the way her hands moved, delicate, controlled yet expressive, gesturing in small arcs over the board, turning pages, resting lightly on the edge of the desk. Each motion seemed to communicate more than the lecture itself, a language of presence that whispered, quietly, "Notice me." During the first break, he lingered near the doorway, pretending to review his notes, but aware of every movement she made. He caught himself imagining the warmth of her hand briefly brushing against his, a casual contact that would feel electrifying only because of how unexpectedly human it would be. The faint scent of her perfume, a gentle mix of something floral and earthy, was subtle yet persistent, leaving an echo in the space even after she stepped away. It wasn't attraction in the way he had felt before, raw and urgent. It was more like a quiet pulling, a curiosity wrapped in admiration, an unspoken question of what lay beneath her calm exterior. He noticed her eyes, thoughtful and observant, catching his own glance now and then. Each time they met, there was a flicker of something unspoken, a hint that there was more behind her composed demeanor. And each time, it left him unsettled, aware of a feeling he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. By the end of that first lecture, he realized that he hadn't been paying attention to the material nearly as much as he had been noticing her. It wasn't inappropriate. It was a fascination born of subtlety, of noticing the quiet elegance in ordinary actions. Something about her presence made the room feel warmer, the words richer, and even the passing moments heavier with significance. That first spark of intrigue, quiet and unassuming, had planted itself firmly in his mind, setting the stage for something neither of them could yet name but both would eventually feel. It was near the end of a lecture when she said it, almost casually, yet the words hit him like a ripple through still water. "Forget everything I taught you." First he blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. The classroom felt suddenly smaller, charged with an energy he couldn't place. There was no malice in her tone, no impatience, just the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what they meant. And yet, it wasn't just about the lesson. He sensed it. She leaned slightly against the edge of her desk, her posture relaxed but intentional, as if she were testing the boundaries of attention and awareness. Her fingers tapped lightly on the surface, an almost imperceptible rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. He caught the faintest curl of a smile at the corner of her lips, subtle enough that he could have imagined it, but her eyes told him it was real. They were steady, observing, and yet there was something in them that suggested mischief, or perhaps curiosity. The words lingered in the air long after she had moved on to administrative notes. He found himself replaying them, turning them over in his mind, wondering if she meant something more. Was it a challenge, a test, or a private message disguised as professional instruction? There was a tension in the silence that followed, a delicate pause filled with the unspoken. Every student had left the lecture hall except him, yet it felt as if the room had closed around just the two of them. His eyes unconsciously traced her movements. The way her hair fell just so across her shoulder, catching the light from the window. the gentle slope of her neck as she bent to write something in her notebook, the faint scent that lingered behind her, soft, warm, calming yet intoxicating. Each detail made his mind feel simultaneously grounded and unsteady. Something about her presence demanded attention, even when the instruction was supposedly about something else entirely. There was a quiet magnetism in the way she spoke. It wasn't loud, flashy, or demanding. It was composed, deliberate, almost conversational in tone. Yet the words carried weight. Forget everything I taught you. It felt less like a command and more like an invitation, wrapped in ambiguity. His pulse quickened not from fear, but from curiosity and something far more dangerous, the recognition that there might be more beneath the surface than simple academic guidance. Even later, as he walked across campus, the echo of her voice clung to him, weaving between the sound of footsteps and distant chatter. He wondered if she had intended him to think so deeply about it, or if it had simply caught him in a moment of heightened awareness. Either way, he knew he would be thinking about it tomorrow and the day after. The fascination had deepened into something he could not name, a quiet, simmering tension that made every glance, every movement, every word she spoke feel like a layer to be slowly unraveled. For the first time, he realized that the connection he felt with her might be something beyond lectures, beyond lessons, beyond the structured boundaries of the classroom. And the thought both thrilled and terrified him. It started innocently enough. Office hours, a library discussion, a campus event. Moments that could have been purely academic, but somehow they never were. Every encounter carried an undercurrent he couldn't ignore. It wasn't intentional on either side, yet the universe seemed to conspire to keep them in each other's orbit, just close enough to notice, just distant enough to make the awareness ache. He remembered one afternoon in the library. She leaned over a textbook to point something out, and their shoulders brushed. A fleeting, accidental touch. One that might have been nothing, but it lingered. Warmth spread from the contact, subtle and electric, leaving him acutely aware of the space between them afterward. He noticed the softness of her sweater against her wrist, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the musty smell of old books. Even the sound of her voice, low and conversational, seemed richer, more intimate, than it had in the lecture hall. It wasn't just physical closeness. It was how she existed around him. The way she would pause in conversation to meet his eyes, a slight tilt of her head, the faint curve of a smile that suggested something unsaid. Sometimes he would catch her gaze lingering just a moment too long, before she quickly returned to her notes, pretending nothing had happened. Each subtle interaction was a conversation without words, a language of proximity and tension that both excited and terrified him. On the campus quad, their paths would cross again. She would walk near him as they discussed some trivial topic, her elbow brushing lightly against his arm as she gestured. The warmth of that contact seemed to hang in the air long after she had stepped away, leaving him aware of an emptiness he hadn't known existed before. Even the way she laughed, soft, controlled, yet unrestrained enough to be disarming, made him lean closer, desperate to hear it fully, to feel that energy brush against him. These moments weren't accidental exactly, and yet there was no rush. There was a deliberate slowness, a tension that built with every shared space, every brush of skin, every fleeting glance. He became conscious of his own reactions. The quickening heartbeat, the way his chest felt tight and warm when she leaned in to explain something, the subtle thrill in seeing her eyes meet his across a crowded room. It was in these accidental proximities that their connection deepened. No words could define it, yet every small touch, every pause, every shared laugh layered itself into something more. A quiet intimacy, a mutual recognition that the space between them was charged with meaning. It wasn't overt, it wasn't rushed, but it was there, palpable and undeniable. By the end of the day, he realized he was chasing more than academic understanding. He was chasing the feeling of being near her, of existing in the space she occupied. The library, the quad, the lecture hall. They all became stages for a silent dialogue of longing and restraint, a slow-burn intimacy that neither of them could, or wanted to, define just yet. It was during one of their quieter moments, after a lecture, in the corner of her office, surrounded by the soft rustle of papers and the muted hum of the building, that he first noticed it, the cracks beneath her composed exterior. She had always seemed so assured, so in control, but that afternoon, there was a pause in her movements, a slight hesitation in her voice that caught him off guard. It wasn't dramatic or obvious. It was subtle, almost delicate, but it spoke volumes. She shared a small story, something personal, not meant for the classroom, not part of the professional mask she wore so flawlessly. He listened, leaning slightly forward, aware of the warmth of her presence, the faint scent of her perfume mingling with the faint hint of coffee in the air. Her eyes, usually steady and measured, wavered just a fraction, and he felt an instinctive pull toward her, a desire to offer comfort without words. As she spoke, her hand brushed against his arm in a gesture of gratitude, brief and almost accidental, yet enough to send a warmth that lingered long after the touch. He noticed the way her shoulders seemed to slump slightly, the way her gaze dropped before flicking back up to meet his, hesitant yet seeking connection. There was a quiet fragility to her in that moment, and he recognized it as a rare gift. The privilege of seeing someone who always appeared untouchable reveal their humanity. He didn't rush anything. He didn't offer solutions or advice. He simply listened, letting the silence between them carry as much weight as the words she spoke. Every subtle movement, the tilt of her head, the soft curve of her lips in a half-smile, the way her fingers lingered on the edge of her notebook, felt charged with unspoken meaning. It wasn't romantic in a conventional sense. Not yet, but it was intimate in a way that made his chest tighten and his awareness of her presence sharper. When she laughed softly at a small joke she made about herself, the sound was warm, tentative, almost shy. He noticed how her laughter brushed against him, not physically but emotionally, filling the space between them with a fragile closeness that had been absent before. It wasn't about desire in a physical sense. It was about recognition, empathy, and the quiet thrill of shared vulnerability. By the time he left her office, he realized that his fascination had deepened into something more nuanced. He felt protective, attentive, almost reverent, aware of the subtle ways she revealed herself only to him. And in that awareness, a tension lingered, an unspoken question of what might happen if this fragile intimacy were nurtured, if the boundaries of student and professor were softened by understanding and connection. For the first time, he wasn't just observing her beauty or grace. He was feeling the weight of her inner world, sensing her hesitation, her quiet strength, and the rare moments when that strength faltered. And in doing so, he felt closer to her than he had ever imagined possible, caught in the delicate balance between admiration, empathy, and a slowly growing emotional attachment. By now, the attraction between them was undeniable, but neither dared to act on it. It wasn't a matter of simple desire. It was a collision of admiration, respect, and unspoken longing that made every interaction both thrilling and terrifying. He found himself acutely aware of the spaces they shared, of how his chest would tighten when her hand brushed his, or how a lingering glance could feel heavier than any conversation. He began to notice the internal struggle in himself, the rational side reminding him of boundaries, of the unspoken rules, of what was expected, while the other part, a deeper, quieter part, thrived on the subtle electricity between them. Even in the presence of others, he felt it. A pause in her laugh that seemed reserved just for him, the way her gaze sometimes followed him across a room, fleeting but impossible to ignore. Each moment was a careful dance, balancing curiosity and propriety. She, too, seemed aware of the unspoken tension. There were times when her smile held a hesitation, as if testing the waters, measuring the appropriateness of leaning just a fraction closer, letting her hand linger a heartbeat longer. A shoulder brushing his, a quiet laugh shared in a crowded hallway, a brief meeting of eyes in passing small, seemingly casual moments that carried weight far beyond the gestures themselves. He realized that they were both conscious of these subtleties, navigating them with an unspoken agreement to respect boundaries while still acknowledging the pull. Even their conversations carried layers of meaning. On the surface, they discussed lectures, projects, and academic questions. Beneath that, there was an emotional undercurrent, questions phrased carefully, stories shared with slight hesitation, words that could be interpreted multiple ways. Every pause, every thoughtful glance, every measured laugh was a quiet negotiation between desire and restraint. He struggled with guilt and fascination in equal measure. Each time her hand brushed his, each time her gaze lingered longer than expected, a storm of conflicting thoughts surged. The thrill of connection, the anxiety of crossing an invisible line, the exhilaration of a secret intimacy that existed only between them. And yet, he couldn't help but crave those moments, knowing that every subtle interaction pulled him deeper into the quiet gravity of her presence. Their hesitation became a language of its own, a slow rhythm of proximity and distance, of careful touches and fleeting glances. There was tension, yes, but also a deepening trust, a recognition that this connection, delicate as it was, mattered enough to handle with care. Every restrained smile, every soft-spoken word, every accidental touch built layers of meaning, reinforcing both the danger and the allure of what could never be spoken outright. By the end of these days, he understood the complexity of what they shared. A connection charged with desire, tempered by respect and morality, and layered with the silent recognition that sometimes the most powerful intimacy is the one held just at the edge, where longing and restraint meet. And in that space, he realized, every brush of skin, every shared laugh, and every lingering glance carried the weight of everything neither of them dared to say aloud. It happened quietly, without fanfare, in one of those moments when the world seemed to shrink around them. Perhaps it was during an office conversation that ran later than usual, or in the library where they were alone amidst rows of silent books, but the awareness between them had shifted. No words announced it, no grand gestures revealed it. Instead, it was a gentle acknowledgement in the way they moved, spoke, and looked at each other. A subtle recognition that the attraction, long simmering beneath restraint, was mutual. He noticed it first in the tilt of her head, the softening of her gaze, and the tiny, almost imperceptible smile that lingered longer than usual. There was no rush, no urgency, only a quiet, steady acknowledgement that they were both aware of the tension they had carried for so long. The world outside the moment seemed distant, and in that space, the usual rules and boundaries felt both present and suspended, acknowledged yet held lightly. Her hand brushed against his again, this time not accidental but deliberate enough to be felt. The warmth of her touch lingered, sending a shiver through him, yet it wasn't provocative in a crude sense. It was intimate, human, deeply grounding. She laughed softly at something he said, the sound carrying a lightness that felt reserved just for him, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met and held. Steady, unspoken, full of recognition. In that shared awareness, conversation flowed more freely, yet there was an unspoken pact of respect. They spoke of books, of life, of things outside the classroom, and every pause between words carried meaning. He realized he was no longer simply captivated by her presence. He was connected to it, drawn into it, aware of the way his heartbeat responded to her smallest gestures. Each glance, each subtle touch, each shared laugh became a quiet confession, an exchange of feelings that neither dared to fully articulate. It was not a reckless desire. It was measured, conscious, and tender. They both understood the lines they could not cross, yet within those lines, they explored a closeness that felt both thrilling and safe. He felt it in the brush of her hand against his forearm, in the warmth of her gaze when she smiled at a small joke, in the gentle inclination of her head when she listened intently. Each gesture carried the weight of acknowledgement, of desire understood but not demanded. By the end of that afternoon, a subtle shift had occurred. He sensed it in the way he walked away, slightly lighter, yet more aware of the space she had left behind, and in the way she returned to her work, a quiet radiance about her that hadn't been there before. The recognition of mutual desire did not need words. It was woven into their gestures, their glances, and the fragile, exhilarating tension that now existed openly between them. In that slow, delicate acknowledgement, both realized that they had moved beyond mere fascination. They had reached a space of trust and emotional intimacy, where desire could exist without overt declaration, where closeness could be savored quietly, and where every subtle touch, every fleeting glance, carried the promise of something deeper, something real, and something entirely theirs. By the time the semester neared its close, the tension that had defined their interactions had softened into a quiet, comfortable intimacy. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden confessions, just a natural rhythm that had emerged from weeks of shared moments, careful touches, and lingering glances. The boundaries remained acknowledged, but within them, something tender and human had blossomed, fragile yet undeniable. He noticed it most in the small gestures that had once been accidental but now felt intentional. Her hand would brush his as she passed him a book, lingering just long enough to leave warmth behind. A soft smile would meet his in the hallway, carrying recognition, humor, and a quiet affection that required no words. They spoke less of rules and more of life. Books, music, the occasional joke about her lectures. Yet each conversation deepened the connection, every silence filled with mutual understanding. They shared moments outside the formal spaces, too. A quiet walk through the campus at dusk, when the air was cool and the sun cast long shadows, brought them side by side, shoulder to shoulder. He felt the warmth of her presence, subtle yet grounding, the rhythm of her steps perfectly in time with his own. A brush of fingers along a handrail, an accidental touch of a shoulder, a soft laugh shared over a fleeting observation. They had learned to communicate through gestures, each one carrying the weight of unspoken emotion. It wasn't about passion or dramatic romance. It was about recognition, trust, and the slow building of something real. When she spoke candidly of her own doubts, he listened not with the intent to advise, but to connect, to witness, to be present. And in those moments, their bond strengthened, not through grand gestures, but through shared vulnerability, subtle understanding, and the quiet certainty that they mattered to each other. The culmination of their connection came not in a moment of dramatic confession, but in the ease of presence. One afternoon, sitting on a bench beneath the filtered sunlight of the campus courtyard, their hands brushed once more. This time, lingering, intentionally, comfortably. He felt the warmth of her fingers against his, the gentle squeeze that said more than words ever could. Their eyes met, steady and soft, acknowledging the journey they had taken together. The fascination, the hesitation, the silent desire, and finally, the deep emotional intimacy that now defined their relationship. In that stillness, he realized that the age gap, the societal expectations, the caution, they had all been navigated not with haste, but with care. And in doing so, they had created something rare. A connection built on mutual respect, slow-burning affection, and a shared understanding of vulnerability. It was a romance that unfolded gently, naturally, and completely. A story of two people discovering each other in the quiet spaces between lessons, touches, and glances. By the time they parted that day, there was no doubt between them. Their closeness was established, steady, and human. A final glance, a soft squeeze of the hand, and a smile that lingered longer than usual told everything. Their story was no longer one of possibility or tension. It had arrived at warmth, intimacy, and a bond that could be felt in every subtle gesture, every quiet laugh, and every shared heartbeat.